Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are today in this large country. I think we'll just give it 1 second to let everybody trickle in here today. Huge thanks to you all for joining us. So, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Kara Vincent, and I'm a knowledge translator with the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, CIPSRT. I would like to warmly welcome you today and thank you for coming to today's presentation on the mental health impacts of wildland firefighting. Next slide, please. I would like, oops, I think we went one too far. Oh, sorry, no, we didn't. Next slide, please. And then again, yeah. Next slide, please. Thank you. I would like to begin our session today by acknowledging the land, Treaty 4 territory, on which today's event is being hosted. CIPSRT acknowledges the importance of the land that we each reside on. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in honoring relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people that call this nation home. Please join us in considering how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I think it's important to reflect on the reasons why we engage in land acknowledgement and the crucial importance of moving toward reconciliation. And because it relates to our topic at hand, I wanted to share a small section of an October 30th news release on the 2025 wildfire season from Public Safety Canada. Since April, the heightened risk and impacts have forced evacuations of more than 85,000 people, including over 45,000 people from 73 First Nations communities. So more than half of Canada's fire evacuees. These numbers represent the lived experiences of thousands of people, including families forced to leave their homes, communities, rallying together, and responders working tirelessly to protect lives and property. End quote. In addition to having significant impacts on the physical and mental health of public safety personnel, wildfires have a disproportionate impact in the lives of Indigenous communities and individuals, some of whom are also first responders. So I'm so happy that we can use conversations like these to move forward in collaboration and with the aim of finding solutions to our shared challenges. Next slide, please. I also invite you all to join us next week for a final discussion in the series on wildland firefighting, focused on the unique experiences and challenges of Indigenous wildland firefighters. And I believe Carrie Lynn is going to pop a link in the chat for us. Thank you. This is where you can register or find more information. Okay, next slide, please. Very quick housekeeping. Please note that in today's session, attendee microphones and cameras are muted. We have, however, set aside lots of time for audience questions. At any time today, you can enter your questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available online shortly after the presentation. You will receive an email notification once the video becomes available. And finally, this event is presented in English with the option of simultaneous captions or audio translation in French. So please use the link and follow the instructions that will be placed in the chat, and which will enable you to log on to our translation platform. Okay, next slide. And now on to the good stuff. It's my pleasure to warmly welcome today's panel. We have joining us Eric Hansen, Ken McMullen, Brett Patuka, and Shannon Wagner. And I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves to our audience. How about Eric? Would you like to start us off?
That'd be great. Thanks so much, Karen. Thanks for this
Mhm.
opportunity to speak. So my name's Eric Hansen. I'm the Critical Incident Stress Management Program Manager with mostly working with BC Wildfire, but our team serves water, lands, resource stewardship ministry, agriculture and foods, and as well as forests overall. I am located in Revelstoke, which is the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa, Sinixt, Secwepemc, and Silks people. And yeah, I have kind of a background in operational wildfire. I still run operations in the Southeast Fire Center here based out of Castlegar. And I'm a chainsaw trainer, so I still get spit chips every now and then and get myself dirty, which is great. But most of my time and energy is focused in and around mental health. So yeah, thanks very much, Karen.
Thank you, Eric. Ken, would you like to go next?
Gladly, and what a pleasure to be with everybody today. And thank you. My name is Ken McMullen. I am the Chief of Emergency Services in Red Deer, Alberta, and I'm also the President of the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs. I've been heavily involved with CIPSRT actually since its inception, and have been very actively involved in the mental health of first responders all across this country. I'm the past co-chair of the Public Safety Steering Committee within CIPSRT. So again, I'm sure there's many of you on the line that I've had the opportunity and privilege to work with. And I just commend you all for your continued dedication and work towards ensuring the mental health safety of all first responders in this country. So I look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Ken. Brett.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you for having me here. My name is Brett Patuka. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. My ancestry comes from the Red River settlement in Manitoba, and over the past couple generations, my family has come across the prairies and settled in Edmonton, which is where I reside and where I'm coming from here at the moment. My professional background stems from paramedicine. Worked as a paramedic in Alberta and Edmonton in the Indigenous community surrounding Edmonton for 10 years, and then taught at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology for another 6 years after that, as well as some international development work, and moved into Indigenous services within the last couple of years. And now I'm the Senior Deputy Fire Marshal, as well as the Training and Accreditation Director with the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council. And with there, I'm overseeing the training as well as the program development for the organization and leading new initiatives. So part of that is to be here, and part of my experience as well too is working within mental health, both as in a professional sense with with clients and patients, as well as with coworkers as well. So yeah, I'm happy to be here to discuss this topic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Shannon.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Wagner, and I'm the interim provost and VP academic at Thompson Rivers University, and also the vice president research here at Thompson Rivers University. And I'm so pleased to be here and for us to be having a conversation about wildfire and mental health. I think it's timely and it's important, and I'm privileged to be part of this amazing panel that's going to be speaking today. So my background is really very much, I'm currently the lead of an initiative called TRU Wildfire at TRU, Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. I also have spent most of my academic life working in the field of public safety and mental health, in particular with firefighters. So a long area of interest and passion for me, and really happy to be here as a contributor, and so humbled to be invited to be part of this discussion today. And last, I spent many years as a clinician in diagnostics for mental health, and so have a real interest in terms of contributing to the conversation from the perspective of a practitioner on that side of the conversation as well. So once again, just really pleased to be here, very humbled to be included, and very much looking forward to the conversation. So thanks to Kara and everyone else.
Thank you so much, Shannon. A warm thank you to the whole panel for being here today. There is just an amazing amount of expertise with us, and I know we're going to have a wonderful discussion. So let's kick it off. And again, I'll remind the audience that they can drop their questions for our panelists into the Q&A box at any time throughout. So, why don't we start, Eric, with you? As a wildfire fighter and as someone who also works closely with wildland firefighters in a mental health capacity, can you describe for those of us who may not know what the job or jobs of wildland firefighting entail and what your observations and or concerns are around the challenges and mental health impacts?
You bet. That's such a fantastic question. And I want to just drift out to the whole crew of people that are there scattered across Canada that have taken the time and energy to tune into this call. And I would say that this, hopefully you're bringing in information that we're passing out to you, but I also would hope that that you're considering is there any action that you can take as an individual, anything that you can do to advocate for supporting wildland firefighters to do the job that they need to do and to support good, solid mental health. That is really the foundation of any kind of natural disaster response. And so, yeah, every single person here has some web to fight a wildfire. It takes people doing all sorts of different jobs, and every person out here has some role to play. So think about maybe a way that you can, as a product of listening to this call, help support us in some way, shape, or form. So that, like I said, there's lots of different people that fight wildfires, from the people putting wet on hot, of which I was for a number of years. I was a crew member, a crew leader, a crew supervisor, sort of worked my way all the way through the org structure until I was running a base of about 80 here in Revelstoke. And so that is one group of people, and we tend to focus a lot on those folks that are going out and dodging the danger trees and managing risk real time in the field. But there's also a whole suite of people that support on the back end, and those folks are equally as impacted by the mental health challenges that impact that first group of folks. So I guess maybe there's sort of three collections of people that fight fire. It is those people that are getting wet and hot and dirty on the fire line, to the folks that are supporting, so the incident management teams, any leadership groups in throughout the province that basically have to manage those resources and reprioritize as priorities shift. And then there's a whole other level above that that works at the government level to support wildfire being prioritized in terms of funding and spending and research and all that stuff. Shannon, of course, has a big hand in making that all happen and is really advocating in a strong way for really solid returns at that level of work. So that's sort of like the three different layers. And I want us not just to consider those folks on the ground, but I kind of have two primary things that I think are significant concerns that I've noted. One very specific and one sort of general. And I'm going to start with the specific one because I think it really ties this discussion in an important way. In 2015, I was responded with the critical incident stress management team to a fatality that happened on the Seashell mine fire. And the fatality was a guy named John Fair. He was a faller, contract faller that was working and was struck by a tree and killed by a tree. And what I saw following that was a really challenging process for everybody involved. It was hard for all three of those levels, not just kind of operationally figuring out how to work and continue to fight the fire while we were dealing with this tragedy and the challenge and the grief and the loss, and the PR and all the parts that come with a fatality. Actually figuring out how to process and work through that. One of the biggest challenges, and this is sort of a multi-agency challenge, is the interview process immediately after somebody is killed. So what happens is the WorkSafe BC comes in, does an interview with their very best people because it's a very serious incident. And then the coroner's office can come in with the same thing, their best people coming and doing the best interview possible. And the RCMP would come in and do the best interview possible. We are obligated, BC Wildfire is obligated by WorkSafe to do another very thorough obligation. So the same people that have just been through an incredibly tragic and difficult event now immediately can be interviewed up to 7 times afterwards, consecutive, once after another after another. This is like incredible to me. I mean, it seems it seems strange, and I saw the negative effects of that after John was killed. Yeah, flash ahead to 2023. I was the wildfire officer in the Columbia Zone near Revelstoke when Devin Gale was killed. She was a friend of mine and a colleague of mine. Interwoven, we know that whole family, her brother and sister both still are wildland firefighters that work with the crews to this day. And I saw the same process happening. This is this many years later. And it sort of has me frustrated and throwing up my hands. There was some small steps that we could take to make things a little bit easier, but it was still essentially that same challenges. And it's not like any one person, one group is doing a bad job. That there needs to be this sort of greater awareness and a sort of a holistic understanding of how to support people that have been through tragic and difficult stuff. So yeah, I maybe the analogy that I'll make before I move on to my next point is really, I feel like it's in some ways similar to how we interviewed people around sexual assault. So in the early 80s, how we interviewed somebody who had been gone through sexual assault is significantly different than how we do it now. And I would ask anybody why that is. I think probably most people would say, well, because the way that they were doing it back then compounded the trauma that folks had gone through at that time. And I think that we are continuing to do that. So that is that's a side issue, but I wanted to land that home because it's really important to me. There's people that I know that have had real challenges because of the way that those processes have been laid out. And it's one of my sort of changing a should to a will. That was something that they had said after people came in to help support us after Devin was killed. A lot of times you feel you raise these I should have questions. I should have done things different, and that's not a very empowered state for somebody who is an active and engaged human being, like many people within the wildfire structure are. So when you can change those shoulds to wills, well, what will you do? This is one of the things that I will continue to talk about until it's shifted and changed. My second point, more general point, is the fact that seasons are getting longer. When I was putting wet on hot, sort of at the crew member level, a 4 deployment season, that's 4 14-day tours, one after another, was sort of seen as like, okay, well, that's an average, season. We might go up a little bit more, it might be a little bit less. This year there was crews that had between 7 and 9 deployments. So that's like 126 days of, 12, 14, 16, 18-hour days of protecting structures, people's houses in places like Kamloops, in places like rural settlements, around Indigenous communities, like working super hard. I have good friends that as they fought fire, had their houses burnt simultaneously. They were putting out the fire and at the same time their house was burning. This is stuff that impacts the people that are on the ground. And then that cascades all the way through the org structure. Everything, we always talk about the corporate wildfire services people that deal with all the claims and all that, the administration component. Their fire season doesn't get started until September, October, November, December. These people are working like it was the middle of busy fire season, but all the way into the fall because of all the work that needs to be done. And then you're planning for the next season. It feels at times relentless, especially with seasons lasting this long. So I see lots of opportunities for hope, and I see a lot of opportunities for things transitioning into greater awareness and making really concrete steps that are making a difference. But those are kind of 2 of the primary things that I would say.
Thank you. I wonder if anyone else, maybe Brett or Ken, there are any other observations you would add to that about the unique physical and emotional challenges of wildland firefighting or emergency response?
Brett, maybe I'll jump in quickly. That's a loaded question, Kara, because I think we could all spend the remainder of this session talking about it. And as I listen to Eric and the similarities to it, when I get an opportunity to speak a little bit more, I will certainly share the uniqueness of the requirements for and the reliance on our municipal firefighters in this sphere of wildland firefighting. And certainly the uniqueness of relying on volunteers in many of these situations to play a critical role in the response. So I'll wait till you get to me on that, Kara. I've got lots to say, but a great introduction so far from Eric.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, I'll just bounce off of something that Eric said here as well too, is that, within the Indigenous space where a lot of Indigenous communities are located within forest zones, and that if Indigenous wildland firefighters are working to put out the fires and fight the fires that are close to them, then it's not really just a job. It's their home. It's the lands that people may be connected to. Maybe it's traditional hunting, fishing grounds. So it has this almost like an extra significance to it as well too, right? And just where Eric mentioned, about people that are fighting the fires while watching their own lands burn and their own places burn as well too. It can have that extra pressure, as well as people, if there's a community that's been evacuated and then members having to stay home to fight the fire to protect their community while also then being separated from their family, not knowing what's happening within that evacuation, then it can add extra pressures. And obviously this is going to weigh heavy on the mental health as well too.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'll just add on to that. Also, like real, there's cultural benefits to protecting that land, but there's also economic benefits. A lot of Indigenous peoples have forest harvesting operations that are happening on their traditional lands. Not this is not an Indigenous context, but I've been on a fire and talking to the person who had the tenure harvesting that land and saying, like, I will be dealing with this for the rest of my life. Like this profoundly. And I talk about kind of like destabilizing somebody from an emotional perspective. If you say their livelihood for the rest of their life has now been impacted by this wildfire, that's pretty extreme. Not to mention the cultural significance and the significance to food sustainability and all that stuff. So yeah, thanks, Brett. That's a really great point.
Yeah, and as part of the cultural significance, there's also the spiritual significance of being tied to the land. And, seeing considering that everything has spirit, and seeing the spirit being alive within the forests and then watching those forests burn, they can, when we consider mental health to be taking a holistic approach that does bring in the emotional, mental, spiritual, psychological, social aspects, that watching the forest burn can play heavily on that psycho-spiritual side of things as well.
Thank you. Shannon, I wonder if I could ask you something specifically. You recently conducted a review of the available academic research assessing what we know about wildland firefighting and mental health. Can you tell us about the key takeaways?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. That's a really good question, and I'll start by saying that I often will speak to becoming involved in the mental health aspects of public safety work, and in particular fire work, in the early 90s. And at that time, I remember sort of thinking I was kind of one of a few people across Canada that was interested in this question. I would do a little bit of search. A few articles would pop up. There was a little bit of research here, a little bit of research there. Fast forward 30 years, now if we look up kind of structural firefighters and mental health, you're going to get a lot of research. And we still have a long ways to go in that area, but we have a lot of research to build a foundation for future research moving on. When we started to ask that same question around wildland firefighters, the search was very limited. So we looked for research on mental health and firefighters who do wildland firefighting specifically, and we got tens of hits, not hundreds or thousands of hits. And so it was a bit of a stark reminder of how early in that research trajectory we are with respect to wildland firefighting. And importantly, many of those hits, not only are there only a few, but most of them are with mixed samples. So they don't necessarily pull wildfire out specifically. They often focus almost exclusively on major events. So things like the Fort St. John fire, or, significant bushfires in Australia, for example. So they focus on catastrophic events, not on kind of the routine pieces of wildfire fighting. And, and importantly, just not that much altogether. So we're really starting to ask those questions. And so I think the main takeaway, one of the main three takeaways, I suppose, is that we just need research. We need a focus on mental health. We need a focus on mental health with wildfire fighters specifically. And we need a focus on the changes or the differences that we see between kind of the structural piece and the wildfire piece, including what Eric alluded to, that, the job is changing. The seasons are hotter, they're longer, they're very much into the wildfire urban interface and the increased responsibility of also taking care of lands and homes that was referred to before. And I think, as we move forward, not only do we need to advance research generally in this area, but we need to think about pieces that are specific to the aspects of the job. And some of those would include things that are similar to the structural literature and can help advise in the way that we move forward with research, but also looking at some of the specific risks that exist in wildfire fighting. And I know we'll talk about many of those specific risks as we go through this discussion, but things like social isolation and the extremeness of the work and the deployment related, nature of that work, and sleep deprivation and isolation from friends and family. And, there's so much, the seasonal nature of the work. There's so many impacts that are very similar where we can learn from the literature that's been developed in municipal and structural firefighters, but there's so much that we have yet to know. And those questions haven't really been addressed. We're very much at the very beginning of building a body of research around wildfire fighters in almost all regards. And I would say mental health in particular is an area where research is just desperately, desperately needed. So that was one of the main takeaways from our work.
Wonderful. Brett, you touched on this, but I wonder if you can talk about the challenges of wildland firefighting that might be unique to Indigenous firefighters.
Yeah, so the challenges can really come at the community levels as well as at individual levels. So at the community level and being a community wildfire crew, a lot of them are structural. So one of the first issues is that there's no governing body that oversees First Nation wildfire services or training. And so it's difficult for Indigenous wildfire crews to be brought into the fold when it comes into provincial or interprovincial wildland firefighting efforts. So what we're seeing now is when provincial systems are being overrun, then the foreign firefighters are being brought in from different countries around the world when there's Indigenous fire crews that are at home and they're ready to deploy and they're trained, but there's no way to bring them into the fold and activate them. So this is something that NIFC is working on in the moment, which I'll get into a bit later on if this question comes up. But yeah, and then there's a disconnect between provincial standards as well as the federal jurisdiction of First Nation lands, as well as in the provincial training system, right? So the training for wildland firefighting is very much siloed within Canada. So each province has its own training regime. And then with the First Nations being on federal lands, that there's a disconnect between that. And it's often difficult for the First Nation individuals to access the provincial training schemes because it requires people to leave their communities and to travel into bigger cities, and there's economic costs and there's social isolation and such that makes it difficult for that to happen. So that disconnect is one of the big challenges. And then the discrepancy and disparities in community capacity and governance stemming from colonization. So there's some communities that may have higher levels of capacity and others that are struggling in certain ways. So they're not having that access to equal services and equal training and equal support, as well as the lack of sustainable funding that comes from Indigenous Services Canada. And sometimes the funding is there, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's promised, sometimes it's not delivered. So not really being able to rely on the funding to support the training as well too. So this leads to a lot of barriers to accessing not only training and deployment, but also being recognized as being the original land stewards and the being interconnected within the forests and just kind of being isolated in certain ways. Now, on an individual level, it also comes down to, as I mentioned earlier, about having to leave home. Right. So it can be difficult for Indigenous peoples to leave their communities and go into the settler colonial society that still is Canada, where there is certain elements of social racism and institutional racism that still happens. And so, for example, the WFX fit test that has to be completed in order to be recognized as a wildland firefighter, people need to leave. They need to travel to a big city. They need to pay for their travel. They need to pay for the test. There's not often opportunities to practice the test before they go. So they might be going into not only the test itself that is foreign and they haven't been adequately prepared for it, but then having the other aspect of being away from home and dealing with the social aspect. And so it adds this extra layer of difficulty for Indigenous firefighters that aren't, that firefighters in the settler communities may not have to face. So yeah, both the community structural as well as the individual challenges.
Absolutely. Building on that,
Sorry,
Brett,
I just wanted
go
to add
ahead,
on
Pete.
one thing. I wanted to give a shout out because there is Brad, I really realize and yeah, take a bunch of those points, and I think a lot of people have seen that, have heard that those are some significant issues, and I want to just give a tip of the hat to BC Wildfire, and I'm not sure how these are working in other agencies, but I know with BC Wildfire they have taken efforts to really change that process a little bit. So normally there's a new recruit boot camp that happens annually to bring Indigenous to bring all wildland firefighters and train them up. But we've also started putting on a more locally oriented Indigenous new recruit boot camp. So not having to pull people out of the community and out of those groups to the same extent that, to go away. Also to break away from and really foster that hiring process. And then there's also the Indigenous Fire Crew program in British Columbia, where communities have put together their own programs where they respond to fires on their land, but that's integrated with the suppression work that BC Wildfire has done. Now, that is just in its infancy. There's so much more work that can be done. There's so much more capacity there. But I'm really hopeful, especially with regards to that and cultural burning. There was a few years ago, I was involved in a panel, and it was on leadership in wildfire. And there was a bunch of prestigious people sitting at the panel, and I was sort of like doing my best to have everyone speak. And about 3/4 of the way through the talk, an elder from the Okanagan Indian band stood up and said, "Look, I see a lot of leaders here, but where's the Indigenous leadership in this group of people?" This was, I think, 2016, and I was like, well, that's a really valid point. And he said, we've been the stewards of this land for countless generations. And he said, my grandfather lit this fire and I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the specific fire, but he was actually hung because he lit that fire as part of a cultural burn practice. And to
Yeah.
think that to do something that you had been doing since time immemorial, maintaining and being stewards of the land, and then having your ancestor hung for doing the very thing that has kept the land healthy and vibrant for so. I mean, talk about what an interesting space to come at and try to integrate into a government structure for fire suppression. And I really, tip my hat to all the Indigenous people that are really leaning into that process and trying to create healthy networks there, both for themselves, but also for everyone else who has a vested interest in going. I mean, so many of our interests are interlinked. And I acknowledge people, and especially Indigenous people, for doing the hard work to overcome colonialism and cultural trauma to do what's right for their communities.
Yeah, thank you. And it is doing right by community, but also the whole of the country benefits from it as well too, right? And this is where I think the recognition really needs to happen as well too, is Indigenous peoples are doing it as well for the growth of the community and capacity building, but also for the benefit of the force. And by benefiting the force, it benefits the industry, it benefits the country, and on and on and on. So, yeah, thank you, Eric, for that.
Brett, building on that, you're leading efforts to develop culturally relevant fire prevention and emergency response training for Indigenous communities. Can you explain some of the characteristics of an Indigenized training curricula, and what ways you feel Indigenous-led fire stewardship principles could and should inform current firefighting efforts?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So coming from regarding the indigenized training curricula, really it's coming from an indigenous worldview that recognizes the connection to the land. And it's not seeing the land necessarily as something like a resource that can give, but also it's an interconnectedness, something that the land is part of life, and it's life sustaining, it's life giving, and there's an integrated relationship with the land. And so coming from that worldview is the basis of the indigenized curricula. And as I mentioned before, it brings in the physical, emotional, psychological, social, and spiritual elements, and that all of those elements are built into the training. And this is what I talk about when I'm saying coming from an indigenized worldview. And then the pedagogy coming from teaching through stories and teaching through hands-on methods, trying to get out of the classroom and get out of that classic sit in a chair, watch a PowerPoint, write a test, but actually getting on the land, listening to the elders, listening to knowledge keepers, fire stewards, and hearing the stories of how the forests have been taken care of for generations, and then passing that knowledge on intergenerationally and learning through hands-on approaches. Trying to address some of the challenges that are faced in the communities and highlighting these challenges, such as geographical isolation, limited internal or outside supports, and limited internal resources within some nations, bringing in the cultural considerations into the training design as well as the curriculum content, and then recognizing that professionals also take on many roles within some First Nations as well. So you might have someone who's a fire chief, may also be the emergency management coordinator, but may also, drive the gravel truck, for example. So understanding that, training it should be all encompassing and really recognize the different approaches that people are coming from and being able to really capitalize on people's diverse knowledge and experience from serving their communities, and then having that coming in, you know, as well as allowing the participants to share that knowledge within the classroom. and it not just be a transfer of knowledge from the educator to the participants, but a sharing of knowledge within that learning space. For the course materials themselves, we like to present materials that reflecting Indigenous communities. So using, pictures and different examples and exercises that reflect an Indigenous way of life. So, for example, with the incident command systems course that we teach, we look at planning a powwow as a way of highlighting the different sections of the ICS regime. Like we've got the planning chief, there's the finance chief, there's the person leading it all. So we try and put that into an Indigenous context. And so this is all of these different approaches are ways to really indigenize the training. Now, the second part of the question was, what are ways that in Indigenous ways of knowing can support the overall wildfire system? And really the answer to that, and from my perspective, is cultural burning. As Eric mentioned, cultural burning has been happening since time immemorial, and then it was outlawed through colonization, and through that, the subsequent to that illegalization of the cultural burning practices comes the mega fires. And those mega fires are now running rampant, out of control. And I think really going back to the original ways of land stewardship and forest management through cultural burning, realizing that not all fire is bad fire, and that a slow, controlled, low-heated burn can clear out a lot of the fuels and really make that forest healthier. So it has less chance of experiencing a mega fire. And again, just coming back to the practice of being connected with the land and seeing it as a life giver rather than just a resource provider. So bringing in worldview, bringing in traditional practices, allowing these practices to continue and celebrating them, and really promoting this across the Indigenous lands across Canada as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I wonder if we can turn to something that we only briefly touched on, the wildland-urban interface. Ken, I wonder if I could ask you to explain the wildland-urban interface to us and the increasing encroachment of wildfire fighting duties onto structural and municipal firefighters.
Yeah, thank you, and a great conversation so far, Brett and Erica. Thank you, Shannon, as well, of course. First of all, I just want to go back to what Brett was just talking about. Two things that you mentioned is that many fire chiefs are also director of emergency management. In fact, the number is as high as 80% of all fire chiefs are also the director of emergency management. So there's a substantial impact in both those arenas. The other thing that you mentioned that absolutely is worth repeating is this concept that fire can be good, particularly in wildland. And I think that there's some education, and maybe we'll get to that near the end when we talk about some recommendations or what can we do differently. But I think that we have to understand that mean that this is really dire strait. There's opportunities for cultural burning. I think we can learn a lot from our Indigenous partners on how to do cultural burning and actually reduce the risk as opposed to not doing so. And we know that there's significant fire load out there that needs to be mitigated. So I just wanted to get to that before I answered your other question, Kara. I think it's important probably at this stage, if we haven't determine the difference, because there is a difference in this country of types of firefighters. We have municipal firefighters, and then we have wildland firefighters. And I'll just explain the difference at a very high level. In Canada, there's approximately 126,000 firefighters made up of career, composite, and volunteer firefighters. 89,000 of those are volunteers, men and women that give back to their community in a very unique way. We can talk about the mental health impact of that here shortly, but for the purposes of your question, the difference being there are men and women municipally trained that have the training, equipment, and expertise to fight fire in structures. They are all hazard responders, so they're the individuals in your communities that respond to medical events, motor vehicle collisions, dangerous goods. Again, municipal firefighters. what we've talked about thus far is primarily about wildland firefighters. Those are the men and women that have the training and expertise to fight fires in the treat areas. Now let's put those two together in this geographical area called the wildland urban interface. And it's simply that it's the geographical area where the fire is leaving the trees and has threatened or is beginning to threaten people and property. Now, what happens is that that interface fire actually lasts a very short period of time, because by the time it gets there, it is extremely rapidly growing. And it'll be in this interface where now those two groups of firefighters have to work very closely together. We are doing that. We are training differently now between the two groups. We are sharing equipment understanding between the two groups. We are not trying to duplicate each other's work because it is very different. We don't necessarily have the training, equipment, and expertise for municipal firefighters to fight tree fires, and vice versa, to have our wildland firefighters protecting structures on anything beyond exposure protection. So what's happening, and I'll just answer this or conclude this by saying, in those communities where we have seen significant wildfires and that interface fire encroaching, majority of the time, those are in municipalities that are relying on paid on call or volunteer firefighters. From a mental health perspective, I want to tell you that on average, across Canada, a volunteer firefighter might respond to 1 or 2 calls per week, on average. And when they're on those calls, primarily, they're there for between 20 and 35 minutes. And they go back, they get back to their business, they get back to their personal responsibilities, etc. What we saw in the wildfire season of 23 that was repeated in 24 and sadly again in 25 is we were asking these individuals to be away from their home for weeks and at times months at a time. Not sustainable. As a result of that, we actually saw a reduction of firefighters in this country. And so there's a recruitment and retention issue with that. There's a mental health issue with that. So, in fact, one of the reasons I'm here in Ottawa is advocating for continued support of all first responders and bringing to light this deficit that we have gaps in our coordination across this country. We have gaps in our training across this country, and there's work for Canada to do. I said it this morning at a caucus meeting in Parliament that it's often unfortunate that we forget in January what we talked about in July. In July, this was all over everybody's minds. We knew that there was wildfires and people were willing to talk and have difficult conversations about it. As soon as there's any sort of precipitation, rain, snow, wildfire is taken off the agenda of conversations. But in fact, that's when we need to talk about it. We need to be talking about it today in order to be prepared for the wildfire season of 2026. So with that, I'll end with that. And I know you've got a series of more questions, Jen.
Thank you, Ken, for explaining that. Shannon, I wonder if you can talk about your research and what it indicates about the key differences from a mental health perspective between structural firefighting and wildland firefighting, and why it's so important that we have research that is focused specifically on wildland firefighting.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kara. I know I alluded to a few of them earlier when I talked a little bit about the need for research in general, but there are a number of similarities, I think, between structural and fire that we need to recognize and give us an opportunity to learn and build on the research that has existed. Things like similarities, and they aren't exactly the same, and I acknowledge that as I talk about it, but just an ability to use as a foundation some of the work that has been done in mental health and structural, things like the impacts of sleep deprivation, things like the impact of being exposed to loss and trauma as part of what you do when you get up in the morning and you go to your job. Most of us go to our jobs and we don't anticipate that today we're going to see somebody lose a loved one or lose their home. And our fire service personnel across the board, whether that's wildfire or structural fire, get up in the morning anticipating that could be part of every day. That's very similar. I think the fact that they respond to fire-related events, they have very similar kinds of training in terms of fire investigation and the use of hoses and nozzles and couplings and all, pumps, all of that is very similar. A similarity in terms of kind of the the paramilitary, I guess is how I would put it, organizational structure that exists across the two. And then also in both environments, I think there's a real feeling, at least in my experience, speaking with both kinds of groups of fire service members, a real feeling of camaraderie or family. And that exists differently in the two groups, but it's quite similar. So when I think about research on wildland firefighters, I'm starting from a foundation of expecting that some of the research that has been done with structural and municipal firefighters and mental health can be from a shared experience. Where I think things are particular to the different groups are things like social support versus isolation. So, there can certainly be a feeling of isolation in structural and municipal departments, but a lived experience of sharing the same hall, where often wildfire fighters are working very independently. In initial attack crews, it might be way up in the middle of nowhere with only 2 or 3 other people that you're separated from physiologically and geographically. So I think the levels of isolation are a particular aspect that we need to look at with respect to wildfire fighters. I think the distinction in terms of some of the pieces Ken spoke to, where both groups are largely considered kind of the all hazards response. Both groups do that work, but certainly a big focus in the structural municipal departments now are around medical and accidents, rescue calls. Where in the wildfire umbrella, it does tend to be primarily, not exclusively, but primarily firefighting in a true wildfire sense. I think those are differences. I think that something that is almost more similar to like a military population is the deployment structure. So where a structural municipal department definitely has an unexpected nature of the calls as they come in, but the stability in the home location, I suppose, tends to be a bit there. Where with wildfire fighters, of course, it's a deployment model, which again is more similar to kind of a military, potentially more similar to the military research, where somebody might get up in the morning and not know what even part of the province or legitimately maybe not what part of the country or what part of the world they're going to on that particular day. So I think that's a particular piece of it. Certainly the limited research that we have right now speaks to the differences in terms of the seasonal nature. So a lot, a good deal of thought needs to be put into what does it look like for workers who work, sometimes, as Eric said, 16, 18 hours a day for a number of months, and then find themselves in a seasonal layoff in the fall and into the winter. And I know that's changing as it becomes a bit of a 365 job. But the research does show us that the mental health implications of the on-season versus the off-season are quite different, in particular with respect to things like sleep and use of substances. I think there's kind of 3 more pieces. I think, that the structural differences in terms of the way that the institutions are set up is quite different, right? So one is a provincial government organization where one is municipal, and the structures around how that employment relation and interactions with their coworkers is quite different. And then I suppose the big one that I would say in terms of the physical piece of it is, in a structural or municipal situation, it does tend to be quite really, really intense, but in shorter bursts, where in a wildfire environment, it can be maybe intense and long-term. So it's sort of a bit different there. And the other thing that I think for both groups is really important and consistently comes up in the research we've looked at and we've done is the routine versus non-routine. And how do people who don't work in these environments, and as researchers, we're not response personnel, so need to have that interaction with people who are actually doing the job to think about what we consider to be routine stressors, organizational stressors, aspects of the employment. We know that's very important in all types of workplaces, but in particular, it's demonstrated in firefighting kind of organizations versus what we consider non-routine. So there's quite a bit of research in both sets around these, what we would consider non-routine or disaster environments. Often what's forgotten is actually the impact and are more flexible, I suppose, what we can do more about. We can't prevent disasters, but what we can do is look at organizational structures and how we set up workplaces to support workers who are working in both of those environments on a day-to-day basis when a disaster is not happening. So just lots and lots and lots of overlap that we can learn from and will give us a good foundation, but so much that we have to learn that is specific to the wildfire fighter environment in particular. And, as I said before, I think we're at the very beginning stages of this body of research and so much work yet to do.
Shannon, I wanted to mention there, I'm really glad that you mentioned those points, and I'll break it down to a very specific example. So a couple of months ago, we were looking to get better service from our service provider. So we did an education and awareness session for the counselors that work for our mental health service provider. And I went through the logs of, for our critical incident stress management team, the last 33 years of logs, and kind of looked at what are the most consistent things that we're responding to as the critical incident stress management. This team, in case people don't know, we have a sort of very acute set of skills that we go in and do a debriefing or diffusing or one-on-ones after a critical incident happens, and it's sort of akin to first aid. We don't have the credentials like you, Shannon. We go and we kind of dress the wound, metaphorically speaking, and assess for need for further follow-up from mental health professionals. This is sort of a peer-based program based on a bunch of volunteers, and we sort of follow up, help people through a difficult time, and that tends to really get people going in the right direction. And if they're not heading in the right direction, we have a full suite of resources we can refer them to. So one of the things that we encountered and that I was highlighting for this group of counselors was car accidents. And so it's funny, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because you would think for sure in structural fire, that's one of the things, that's some of the bread and butter and some of the things that I really am glad, living on the Trans-Canada Highway here, my friends that are structural firefighters, they go and do just heroic and a bit horrible work to go in, but that's sort of part of what they expect to do. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's any easier, but you expect to go and do that. And yet wildland firefighters, as you mentioned as well, we stretch geographically. Sometimes we're driving through multiple provinces. There was teams this year that drove to Manitoba. We spend a lot of time on the road and therefore end up encountering a lot of car accidents. So one of the most common responses that we end up following up with was after car accidents. So here's folks that are expecting to go to a fire, and instead of going to a fire, we end up being first on scene to a car accident. So it's interesting because we deal with a lot of the same things, but as you mentioned, it's part of what you expect in a structural fire job, and it's not necessarily part of what you expect in a wildland fire environment. So I see it. I think it's important that we start to kind of like parse those things out, while at the same time, like you said, scooping the structural and wildland groups together. At the Canadian Fallen Firefighters Memorial in Ottawa, I cannot tell you how just supported and loved I felt as a wildland firefighter from the greater body of structural firefighters. And I really feel like for the first time, this is the first time that there's wildland firefighters added on the memorial wall in Ottawa. Very, very powerful, and really shows us, okay, great. There's a lot that we can exchange back and forth. Same thing in Victoria, the extra plaque added for wildland firefighters at the memorial in Victoria. So I believe that there's a lot of crossover, but I also think that we can't paint that same brush over everyone. Love to be scooped in, but then there's some nuances with each of the jobs that I think are worth teasing out, because wildland firefighters have, as you mentioned, specific things that are stressors and potential challenges from a psychological health perspective. So
yeah, thanks for that, Eric. And I would add two kind of responses to that. One, I think over the last 30 years, we've spent a great deal of researchers' time and attention, trying to determine is this work potentially creating an environment where mental health needs a particular sort of look. And I think 30 years later, after being involved in this field for so long, I feel like we know the answer to that now. We know that the answer is we need to give special care to people who work in public safety, people who work in police, fire, ambulance, wildfire. We need to give special care to those groups in terms of mental health. So I think we're at the point now in the research literature that whether you're a structural firefighter or you're a wildfire fighter or you're a paramedic like Brett, we no longer need to ask that question. We need to move from are they at particular risk to how do we help them mitigate that risk and move forward in a healthy way. So I think in terms of the research literature, we're at a different place than we were before, and our questions need to change, right? We need to move from is it to what do we do about it? The second thing I would say is just to build on what both you, I think all three of you have said, but definitely Eric and Ken, you mentioned specifically is the coming together of structural and wildland, even over the last 5 years. So I think even 3 or 4 years ago, I still felt like these two groups didn't quite know each other the same way as that now. I feel like the coming together, even over the last 2 or 3 years, is remarkable. And the support that is coming together both emotionally, psychologically, but also practically, starting to do shared response and those kinds of things. And I think it's a major and it's a significant and it's a really, really positive move for all kinds of reasons that I'm very, very happy to see, and I hope will be reflected in our provincial, our national response, and also in the literature that we see starting to come out for research. So thanks to all three of you.
I'm just gonna jump in and add to that, and what wonderful comments, and couldn't agree more. I think there's two things that I want to speak to, and that is absolutely this continued advancement in the cooperation between the two groups. It's happening. I was here in Ottawa as well, representing the Canadian Fire Chiefs for the fallen firefighters. I was in Jasper when some of these major wildfires have occurred. And again, we have to work together. There's no doubt about that. The other thing that I think to your original comment, Shannon, is what are similar. I'm here to tell you that when I say public safety personnel, I'm referring to police, fire, EMS, communications officers, wildland firefighters. The list goes on, but that really is the core group as we see it. There's a very unfortunate statistic, and that is less than 2% of the entire human population hear, see, and smell what that group of first responders hears, sees, and smells. I don't differentiate when I ask a firefighter if you're a wildlander or if you're a municipal. That's the reality, and these are the things why we need to pay such close attention to the tools that are available to first responders on the resiliency front as well as on the reaction front. But there's still a stigma, and I think you all know that. There's a reality to this, and we've got some barriers to break down internally within our own systems to say it's okay to not be okay. It's all right to seek help, but we still have some work to go.
Can I just follow up on that, Ken? I really think that there's the folks that wildland firefighters are and structural firefighters are in many ways is very practical and pragmatic people. Like when something works, you understand that it works and you understand that produces the outcomes you're looking for. And really, I mean, all of these folks are public servants. We are all looking to serve the greater benefit, the greater whole. People are working sometimes at not particularly glorious wages in totally inglorious situations to do the really hard work that nobody else necessarily wants to do or is qualified to do. And so I think when product comes out and when help arrives that works with regards to mental health, people see that and sort of recognize it and jump on it immediately. So one of the things, as you just mentioned, is the care associated and sort of like that grouping in. Shannon, you mentioned in the last 5 years, and Brett, you mentioned as well with Indigenous crews working together more collectively, more collaboratively with government-funded wildland fire groups. I really see that happening. That's a big thing. I've really noticed with the program Resilient Minds, and I'm going to lay that out as a specific example. So Resilient Minds is a 2-day training course developed by Canadian Mental Health Association, and it was a course developed through the Fraser branch in Vancouver, and that was developed for structural fire and has gone across the country. I think that it had a lot of value, and big credit to the wildland fire leadership in BC Wildfire for recognizing, I believe it was after the 2017 fire season, and saying, hey, this has such value, regardless of that it was built for a structural fire audience. This is the material that we need. And when I did that course, it was like learning how to fire up a Mark III pump for the first time. Like you were like, oh, we need this, like this is a very tangible, very usable tool. How many times have I been caught flat-footed over the years when somebody has said, hey, a friend of mine just committed suicide, or hey, a friend of mine was just struck by a tree, or our crew went through an aviation incident, like these things, and you're sort of like, bah, bah. Whereas, if there's a fire, all the things to do, right? You go to the water source and you find the pump and you prime it and you lay out all the hose. Like that stuff all comes really naturally. And yet we recognize this as part of the work that we do. So when Resilient Minds came along and we could do that, I think everybody went, oh, thank goodness. And so we adapted it for the wildland fire audience. And so now that is kind of traveling across the country, different agencies. Yukon has done it, Parks Canada has done it, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, they've really taken it on, and many other people have. So in that sense, I think it's really good. The difficulty that I've had, because in doing it, is really the research is really based on a lot of structural fire research. So Shannon, to your point, I feel like when we can start to lean on some of the research that done by, I know your master's student there, Alex Lane, has done a really great paper talking about the impacts of wildland fire mental health. Patricia O'Brien in the States has done some great work, again, talking about how wildland fire it has unique challenges, and there's many of the same challenges, but I think to be able to start to specialize some of those materials under that large branch. I know there's been lots of initiatives where structural fire has started to share resources similar to Resilient Minds with the wildland fire audience as well. And I sort of have a limited scope within British Columbia, but I see that starting to happen. And that's why I'm here, right? That's my value proposition, is that there's so much hay to be made within this field across Canada. And I really feel like BC Wildfire is a good medium, and it's definitely an organization that's primed for it. But yeah, anyways, I wanted to follow up and say that. And thanks.
And if I could, because you opened that door, I can't agree enough in that concept about getting programs available to both municipal as well as the wildland firefighters. I'm happy to say that I'm aware of in Alberta, Alberta Wildland has partnered with Wayfound. They're using the program called Before Operational Stress, the BOSS program. Regardless of insert name of program here, I think that there's valuable programs out there. I think that there's wonderful work that can be done. These partnerships between our mental health providers and our agencies that are involved in firefighting in this case, but of course all first response, this is making such a tremendous impact to those. Right now in Alberta, like I say, for the first time this past summer, they had clinicians and they had those supporting wildland firefighters out in the field. We had never seen that before in Alberta. And so this is something trending in the right direction. So thanks for bringing that up, Eric, and I couldn't agree more.
It's so cool to have that recognition that mental health support on the fire line is actually something, and not just on the fire line, in the command centers as well. I've seen that. And then BC Wildfire has actually doubled down in that realm as well, because as we all know, it's not just all contained up here, your whole body, it's a full body experience. When you go through trauma or challenging situations, that is through your whole body. So we actually have a whole program of occupational therapists that are going out and are actually on the fire line. So when people are coming back from the end of the day, they're working on those issues right then and there. And I've heard from those folks to say, like, actually, I've just been working on someone for something relatively benign, and that person is just, broken down in tears, releasing some of that stuff from the day. And that has happened in the command centers as well, right? We have those same folks. Just because you're on the fire line doesn't mean you get exclusive access to this. It's in the command centers as well, which you have a lot of stress in that situation. They are oftentimes working through the same traumas. but they don't have the physical outlet to be able to move your body. You know, when I was out in the field more than I am, I knew when I was stressed out, it was always time to go out and look at the next 3 days work. Okay, I'm going to go for a walk, let my body kind of work through that. If you're cooped up staring at an Excel spreadsheet that is not showing you the right things, and you know that there are a lot of people around the province are depending on you, that's a hard place to be. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here as well too, and just make a note on what Eric mentioned about the Resilient Minds program. And this I'm going to bring back to a question that was asked of me earlier about indigenizing the curriculum content. Is that the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council and other Indigenous organizations worked with the Canadian Mental Health Association to indigenize that Resilient Minds program. It's called the Resilient Minds for Indigenous Responders. And what this course does is it takes the same core concepts of the Resilient Minds course, but it brings in the elements of the Indigenous worldview and aspects such as the different resilience levels being faced through intergenerational trauma and residential schools, for example, responding to people within your own communities, which may or may not be your family members as well too. And so learning how to have conversations with people, you know, within your own community, and doing it from an Indigenous lens. And so I think this is just a good example of what I mentioned earlier with the question that did come up about indigenizing content. This is a perfect manifestation of that. And I just want anyone who's in the webinar here to know that that course does exist. So if you are an Indigenous responder in an Indigenous community, you just know that there is a mental health course that's designed specifically for you, and it is accessible through CMHA as well as through NIFC. So just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for touching on the mental health training efforts currently in place. I wonder if I could pose a question to the whole panel about what further recommendations you might have in terms of what's needed, what more is needed.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm sorry. I'll just throw in. Sorry, Brett. I'm just going to throw in. I honestly believe that interview process post a critical incident, post trauma, post incident needs to change. I'm just going to throw that out there. I feel like sometimes I'm banging my head against the wall trying to make shift and change in that, and I'm just tossing it out to the whole collective here to see if we can't collectively figure out ways to streamline that process. That is one specific thing that I think needs to change.
I would just like to reinforce something that Shannon said earlier about just understanding the inherent challenges to mental health as working within this field, and just almost assuming that mental health and wildland firefighting go together, not just, you know, if there's a potential chance of having mental health challenges, but there is a potential chance, right? There is that chance, and that it needs to be addressed preventatively as well as retroactively as well too. I think that was such an important point, Shannon, and I just wanted to really highlight that again.
Thanks, Brett. And I would add to that, I think all the, over the last few years, we've done systematic review research, which is essentially kind of pulling all of the literature to have a take-home message, if you want to think of it that way. And I think across the public safety, mental health literature, to Ken's point, not necessarily differentiating by any particular public safety area, but just folks who get up in the morning and know that loss and trauma might be part of what they do in that day. What we know now is that the prevalence data is pretty prevalent. We have lots of prevalence data. What we don't have is good information about the prevention and the intervention aspects. So we've got prevention, we've got intervention research, but we don't have it specific to public safety personnel, where we don't know that it's exactly the same, or that it works the same, or that we're using the right sort of methods or approaches. And so I would say one of the things I would recommend for the field as a whole is we need to look at prevention and we need to look at intervention. And those are the two areas where research, information, knowledge, and practice is just not where we need it to be in order to serve the public safety personnel in the way that I think that we deserve, that, you know, they deserve to be served in the way that they serve society.
Maybe I'll just wrap that up and try to combine all of those answers into two things. We need to continue to support this financially from a national level. We need to have the funding in place to ensure that the appropriate education is then funneled down to all of these public safety personnel. Access to this information is still a challenge. Keeping in mind, speaking and representing the fire service, 126,000 firefighters, 89,000 volunteer in very remote parts of this country, don't always have the same access, not only to the material, but to skilled, qualified professionals that are willing and able and capable of taking on the work of working with a first responder. It's very different from a clinical perspective, understanding the work of these 2%, I remind again, of the human population that deal with these types of calls. I think that the other thing that we talked about is this need for a coordinated approach, this need that the Canadian Fire Chiefs continues to advocate for the creation of a national fire administration, a fire advisor, a fire liaison, call it what it is. We need to have people at the federal government looking at this, looking at all the compounding intersections of the types of responses that our public safety personnel are responding to. The increased call volumes that we're seeing across Canada is only having a long drawn out impact on all first responders. And so we have to have more money available. We have to make it available to those on the front line.
And sorry, can I also just highlight something you said before, because I think this is really important, is the destigmatization of this type of work. Like within wildland fire and within structural fire, I think the more opportunity that leaders have to be able to say, hey, look, I use mental health services, I get counseling, that we should start to refer counselors more like we would refer a physio and say, hey, I've got this really good counselor in town, you should go check them out. And that doesn't seem weird. It just seems like, Brent, you mentioned it, this is an important part about how we need to run business. And it's not just about protecting ourselves when bad stuff happens. I think we all understand that it's not weakness if you need to, seek help afterwards. It's part of having a resilient strategy of strength. But also, there's like front end benefits to this as well, Shannon, as you mentioned, that when we can do this, we underscore operational excellence. Like this allows us to be better public servants. This allows us to do our job better. And when we step up as leaders and say, hey, I use these services, this is part of what you need to do to be a good firefighter, then I believe that breaks down a lot of the barriers and empowers us to really lean into this work.
I love it, and I know I'm gonna repeat a phrase of good friend Chief Matt Pegg, former Chief of Toronto, says we have to make it okay to get a checkup for the neck up. It's such a wonderful phrase, and it's okay to when you do your annual physical to get your hearing checked and your eyes checked. Why don't we make it okay to get our psychological assessments done at the same time? I think one of the challenges that we continue to face, and I know we're running out of time, this is the reality. In Canada, primarily North America, in 10 cents of every dollar still goes to prevention. 90 cents goes to response. We have to change that. We have to, whether we're talking mental health, whether we're talking how to prepare our country for what's to come, we need to reverse that. 90 cents of every dollar needs to go to prevention, 10 cents to response. And we've got some work to do on that.
Absolutely. I want to acknowledge that we're getting some questions here in the chat. I apologize if we won't get a chance to get to your question, but I do see a couple of folks wondering about return to work issues. So let me see if we can address one of these. Can you speak to the process of supporting folks through return to work in wildland fire management roles, from stress injury and some of the challenges with working through workers' compensation processes for psychological injuries? Maybe I'll also read the other question related to return to work. How can we support wildland firefighters who have a psychological injury in returning to the workplace? I feel like we talk a lot about mental health and recognize it's an issue, but there's a lack of discussion on how we can better support people in returning to work after this type of issue. So yeah, two questions there on return to work. I wonder if anybody wanted to discuss.
I have a lot of experience in this area and helping support people in through returning to work, and it is really challenging. The lack in synchronization between the fire response organization and in the body that supports the individual to be off work. So WorkSafe BC would be an example in British Columbia. There's a lot of work to be done there. And I would say it's very easy to just say, well, WorkSafe needs to do it better and BC Wildfire needs to do it better. I think that when we can create, yes, and I would agree that that is the case. But I think there is a lot of people that are making concrete steps in the organization. For instance, we have a psychological health and safety team within BC Wildfire that are working to get into alignment with the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace, as are many agencies across the country. I think any of the work that we do there is going to help. But more specifically, as individuals, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, folks here on this call can work to help destigmatize getting the appropriate support, can help people act as sort of like I always think of it as like a superpower backpack from a video game or something, where you like hop onto that person and empower them with added foresight, perspective. You're not making decisions for anyone, but you're trying to support them to find the resources that are out there. It needs to go from both ways. The level that Ken is functioning at that national level, there needs to be change happening there and filtering down to provide a context for care and support on a structural level. But then there also needs to be, from every single person on this call, if you know a wildland firefighter, if you know somebody who's struggling, make an effort to reach out to that person. If you've struggled yourself, I mean, that's why I'm here. I have had a mental health claim with WorkSafe BC. I go to counseling on a regular basis. I am also a leader in this organization, and I think that you can do all of those things at the same time. Post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth don't have to be binary. They can happen simultaneously. And so I believe that when you can kind of recognize that, one, it empowers you as an individual that's struggling, and two, it empowers you to be able to help the people that are out there and around you navigate what is a very complex and complicated system. It's not set out properly. We can't just wait till the system is set up perfectly. We need to right now, right here and now, we need to start moving and supporting those people, calling those people, sending them a reminder text, letting them know that you're there and that if they can help, if you can help at all, you're there. And also we're advocating on that national and provincial level to be able to make it better and easier for everyone. That's part of the reason why I brought up the interview process post critical incident to kind of highlight specifically that issue. Hopefully that's not like too talky aroundy, but those are my thoughts.
I just add to that, Eric. I think everything that you just said is really very much supported by the research literature on duty to accommodate, return to work, all of the different pieces. And that's that we need to, largely our systems are often set up where the individual needs to return to work. And what research consistently tells us, although it's hard and we're not very good at it, but I think it bears repeating, is that there's always three levels to a successful return to work. The individual factors, kind of the individual workplace factor, or the factor of the organization within which you work, and then at the sort of social level, organization of society level. And if all three of those factors aren't working together to support return to work and well-being in the workplace and all of the things that we've talked about today, without one, we're not going to get the same success as when we put all three together. So just it always bears repeating that, yes, individuals are involved in return to work, but as are organizations and as is the social system and the political system that we work in. And those three things need to be working hand in hand. And again, it's hard and we're not always super good at it, but I think that's the state within which we need to seek.
Thank you. Thank you. I know we're rapidly running out of time, but I'm so pleased that somebody has asked a question in the chat about resources for families, because this is something we haven't touched on. I wonder if we can talk um, about what we know about the impact of wildland firefighting, either from a research perspective or a lived expertise perspective, about the impacts on families.
I mean, that it has been my life, like I have rarely scraped the bottom of the well, more so than in 2023. You have 80 people that are looking to you after an incredibly tragic event, and I also have a family. It profoundly impacts people's families. This structure, Shannon, as you alluded to earlier on, where you are away for up to sort of 130 days a year. It's difficult. The amount of weddings I've missed over the years, the amount of, family engagements, your kids growing up, milestones, all of those things are incredibly impactful. And they're worthy of mention. Brett, as you mentioned, being away from your home has even different significance from an Indigenous perspective, right? You have this work profoundly impacts families, and there's so much opportunity there to support families. Specifically after Devin was killed in 2023, we closed the base to everybody except for the wildland firefighters, where we had a space to get together and to talk and be together for the week afterwards. And at the end of that week, it was a closed space for the firefighters and their families. And we arranged specific counseling for not only the firefighters, but for the firefighters' partners and families as well. So, that's my lived experience. I can tell you that I have, while I'm firefighting, it happened more than once where somebody said, well, it's either me or your job. Partners that I no longer have, and I have an incredibly resilient and amazing partner right now that really does a huge part of public service by the fact that she fosters our family and moves our family together forward. So that's my lived experience. It impacts us and as wildland firefighters, and it impacts these communities in a big way. And I feel like there's very little that's being done, but it's an important part. We don't just work as cogs in the wheel. We work as parts of a greater unit, and those families are part of communities as a greater unit. So yeah.
I can just certainly echo that. 28 years in the service, you can't get this far without your social networks and your family networks, and we never thank them and recognize them enough. And it's not until dire straits that they really come out and tell us the impact that our careers had on our family. And as they mature and as they get older, it's amazing. I've got 4 adult children now. For them to share their experiences of me being in Fort McMurray and Jasper and all of these places that I just went to work and did my thing, and they were stuck just with the images of where I was headed, as an example. Dr. Kelly Schwartz out of the University of Calgary doing some tremendous work on a family program. It's a Family First is the name of the program. I just throw that out there for interest. Because it's gaining a lot of traction in Alberta, particularly about how do we work with the families of first responders. It's way too late. We have to just recognize we're late out of the gate on this. We've got a lot of ground to make up for. But absolutely, there's no doubt in any literature that there's a significant impact to our families. So with that, I know there's probably family members on these calls and on this. So thank you for all of your support to allow us to do what we do.
Thank you, Ken. I'm so sorry to say we're just about at the end of our time. I feel like there is so much more we could talk about, and just such amazing questions in the chat that we just didn't get to. We could talk for another half hour easily. But unfortunately, that's all of our time. I want to thank our panelists for what has been such a wonderful discussion. Shannon Wagner, Ken McMullen, Brett Patuka and Eric Hansen, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your research and your dedication to this critical topic. Thank you to my SIPSR teammate behind the scenes, Carrie Lynn, for her technical assistance today. And our audience, thank you for joining us and being so thoughtful and so engaged. And I do hope you'll join us again next week. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All the best.